I remember cold. Specific cold. The kind that settles into bone marrow at -18 degrees Celsius in the underhive detention block where they kept us before collection. I was 14 standard years old. My hands had begun sparking 3 months earlier. Blue-white discharge that jumped from my fingertips to metal surfaces. My father saw it happen once. He turned away. He did not speak to me again. 2 weeks later, the Arbeits came. They tested me with a device that hummed near my skull. The reading was positive, Psyker active, mutation detected. I was placed in restraints and transported to the holding facility with 43 others. Some were children, some were elderly. All of us had manifested. All of us were dangerous. The black ships arrived on the 3rd month of my detention. Vast and lightless, they descended through the hive city's atmospheric layers without ceremony. We were loaded into cargo holds in groups of 50. The interior was dark. The walls hummed with suppression fields that pressed against my thoughts like physical weight. I could feel the other psychers around me, their minds leaking fear and confusion and desperation. The fields dampened our abilities but could not eliminate them entirely. We were still conduits. Still dangerous. The crew wore null collars and kept their distance. The journey to Terra took 4 months. We lost 11 psychers during transit. Their minds broke under the suppression. They screamed until their throats bled, then stopped screaming and stared at nothing. The crew removed them during sleep cycles. I do not know what happened to the bodies. The remaining psychers learned not to ask questions. We learned not to look at each other for too long. Eye contact created connections. Connections created resonance. Resonance attracted attention from places we had been taught not to think about. Terra was golden. I had expected something transcendent. Instead, I saw a sprawling cityscape of administrative buildings and processing centers that extended beyond visual range. The palace itself was visible in the distance, vast and ornate, but we did not approach it. Our transport diverted to a facility designated Telepathica Station Secundus. The building was fortified. Thick walls, reinforced gates, gun emplacements tracking our arrival. We disembarked under guard and were processed through identification screening. Name, age, hive of origin, manifestation date, psychic rating. I was classified as beta grade, moderate potency, significant risk, viable for sanctioning. They explained the procedure during orientation. A proctor in crimson robes stood before us in a lecture hall designed to hold 200. There were 37 of us remaining from the original transport group. The proctor's voice was augmented, mechanical, and clear. He told us we would undergo soul binding, a ritual that would connect our consciousness directly to the Emperor himself. The connection would provide protection against warp predation. It would allow us to use our abilities in service to the Imperium without succumbing to corruption. It would be excruciating. Many would not survive. Those who did would be changed. The proctor asked if we understood. We were not given opportunity to respond. The soul-binding chamber was deep beneath the facility. We descended for 30 minutes through security checkpoints and sealed bulkheads. The chamber itself was circular, inscribed with symbols I could not read. Psychic wards, the proctor told us. Protection for the sanctioners, not for us. We would face the Emperor's presence unshielded. That was the point. Those who could endure the connection would emerge sanctioned. Those who could not would die or be rendered catatonic. Acceptable losses. The Imperium required psychers. The selection process was brutal but necessary. They brought us in one at a time. I waited in an antechamber with the others. We could hear screaming through the walls, not constant screaming, intermittent. Sharp bursts followed by silence. Then the next subject would be brought in. The silence after each session was worse than the screaming. It meant they were removing someone who could no longer scream or no longer existed in a state that required removal. The wait lasted 6 hours. 17 psychers entered the chamber before me. 11 emerged. 6 did not. When they called my designation, I stood. My legs were numb. I walked into the chamber. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, blue-white like my discharge had been. 3 sanctioners stood at the chamber's perimeter, robed and hooded. They did not speak. One gestured toward the center of the circle. I walked to the designated position and stopped. The symbols around me brightened. I felt the wards activate. Pressure against my mind, different from the suppression fields. This was not dampening. This was channeling, directing my consciousness towards something vast and distant and utterly inhuman. The connection formed. I cannot describe what I felt. Language is insufficient. My mind touched something that burned. Not metaphorical burning. Actual burning. My consciousness was being seared by proximity to a presence so immense that comprehending even a fraction of it was like staring into a star. I screamed. I could not stop screaming. The presence pressed into my thoughts, reshaping them, branding them with something that felt like fire and gold and absolute authority. I was being rewritten. Core elements of my psyche were being overwritten with something else. A seal, a binding, a connection that would anchor me against the warp's pull. The process lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, I collapsed. My nose was bleeding. My eyes were bleeding. I could taste copper and ozone. The sanctioners approached. One checked my vital signs. He nodded to the others. I was viable, sanctioned. I had survived. They helped me stand and escorted me from the chamber. My legs would not support my weight. They carried me to a recovery ward and placed me on a cot. I lost consciousness immediately. I woke 36 hours later. My head felt different, heavier. There was something in my mind now that had not been there before. A presence, not conscious exactly, more like a seal, a mark. When I reached for my psychic abilities, I could feel the seal's influence. It constrained how I accessed the warp. It limited what I could channel. It provided protection, yes, but it also provided control. I was sanctioned. That meant I was permitted. It also meant I was bound. They trained us for 11 months. Psychic discipline, control techniques, combat applications. The Scholastica Psychana instructors were sanctioned psychers themselves, decades into service. They taught us to channel our abilities through the soul binding rather than around it. The binding was not a limitation, they said. It was a framework. It gave structure to something inherently chaotic. We learned to manifest psychic lightning, to reinforce our physical forms, to sense warp signatures, to shield our minds from hostile intrusion. We learned the prayers and litanies that helped focus our concentration. We learned to recognize the early signs of warp contamination. We learned what happened when psychers fell. They showed us a holding cell during the 6th month of training. A failed psyker was contained there. He had been sanctioned 10 years prior. His binding had degraded. He had attempted to continue his duties despite sensing the deterioration. By the time he reported to his supervisors, it was too late. Something had entered him. Not full possession, partial. The entity was confined to portions of his consciousness, warring with his remaining self for control. He sat in the cell, chained to the wall, speaking in two voices. His own voice begged for death. The other voice laughed and described what it would do when it achieved full manifestation. The instructors told us this was our fate if we ignored warning signs, if we failed to report binding degradation, if we believed we could manage the deterioration alone. The failed Psyker was executed 3 days after they showed him to us. Bolt round to the skull. Immediate cremation. His remains were disposed of according to protocol. The instructors used his death as a teaching moment. Early detection was critical. Bind-in degradation could be managed if caught in time. Reinforcement rituals existed. Stronger wards could be applied, but secrecy was fatal. Pride was fatal. The moment we felt the binding weaken, we were required to report it. Delay would result in our death and potentially the deaths of everyone near us when we finally failed. I was assigned to the Astra Militarum after completing training. Primaris grade Psyker, they designated me, combat capable. I was shipped to a regiment designated the 117th Cadian, deploying to a war zone in the Damocles Gulf. My role was tactical support. I would provide psychic reconnaissance, manifest offensive abilities during engagements, and shield command personnel from warp-based attacks. I was issued standard guard equipment, modified for Psyker use. A force rod, amplifying my channeled energies. Psychic hood, reinforcing my mental defenses. Hexagrammic wards sewn into my uniform. I joined the regiment on their transport 3 weeks before planetfall. The other guardsmen feared me. This was expected. Psykers were necessary, but never trusted. Witches, they called us when they thought we could not hear. Abominations, sanctioned mutation. The officers enforced discipline, but they could not enforce acceptance. I was quartered separately from the standard infantry. I ate separately. I trained separately. During briefings, the other guardsmen maintained physical distance, not overt hostility, just caution, the kind you show to something dangerous that might malfunction. One soldier did not maintain distance. His name was Callum. He was a Vox operator, 24 standard years old, assigned to the command squad I would be supporting. He had gray eyes and a scar across his left cheek from shrapnel during a previous deployment. When I joined the command squad for the first time, he nodded to me. Not a formal acknowledgement, just a nod. Human recognition. The others had looked through me. He had looked at me. During the approach to planetfall, he sat beside me in the troop hold. The other soldiers shifted away. He did not. He asked me how the soul binding worked. I told him it was painful and permanent. He asked if I could still feel the Emperor's presence. I told him I could feel something. Whether it was the Emperor or simply the seal's resonance, I could not determine. He said he envied that, to feel connected to something larger than yourself. I told him the connection was not comfort. It was obligation. He nodded and said obligation was all any of them had. At least mine came with certainty of purpose. We deployed to a planet designated Viridian 3. Industrial world, population 2 billion, under assault by a Tau expeditionary force. The regiment's objective was to reinforce the PDF and hold strategic mining facilities until Imperial Navy support could arrive. The fighting was brutal. Urban combat through manufactorum districts and Hive City outskirts. The Tau deployed advanced weaponry and disciplined firecast warriors. Our advantages were numbers and faith. We died in greater quantities than they did. But we continued deploying. Reinforcements arrived as we fell. The Imperium could replace losses faster than the Tau could inflict them. Attrition was our strategy. I manifested psychic lightning during my first engagement. Channeled through my force rod, directed at a Tau fire warrior team advancing on our position. The lightning arced across 3 targets, disrupting their armor systems and incinerating flesh beneath. They died screaming. The smell of burned meat and ozone filled the air. The other guardsmen stared at me. Callum was reloading his laser gun. He glanced at the bodies, then at me, then back to his weapon. He said nothing. The engagement continued. I killed 17 enemies during that first battle, used psychic abilities to collapse cover, to shield our squad from incoming fire, to sense enemy positions through walls and relay coordinates. The officers commended my performance. The other guardsmen still maintained distance. Effective and feared were not mutually exclusive. I was useful. That did not make me trusted. Callum approached me after the engagement. We were in a temporary fire base, taking 6-hour rest before the next advance. He asked if channeling the lightning hurt. I told him it did. The power flowed through me, but it burned as it passed, like forcing electricity through organic tissue, which was essentially accurate. He asked if the soul binding made it easier. I told him the binding provided structure, but not comfort. The pain remained. I had simply learned to function through it. He nodded. He said pain you could function through was better than death you could not. I agreed. We fought together for 7 months. 17 major engagements, dozens of smaller skirmishes. The regiment took 63% casualties during that period. Replacements arrived. We integrated them and continued operations. Callum survived every engagement. So did I. This created a statistical anomaly that neither of us discussed. Survival in extended combat was unlikely. Survival together was even less likely, but statistics are not fate. We both continued functioning, that was all. During the 8th month, I noticed something. A sensation, faint at first, like pressure behind my eyes. Not painful, just present. I dismissed it as fatigue, combat stress, inadequate rest. The sensation persisted. After 2 weeks, I recognized it for what it was. The soul binding was flexing, not failing, not yet. But the seal was under strain. I could feel it adjusting to contain something that was pressing against it from the other side. I reported to the regimental commissar immediately. He was a man named Hendrik, 47 years old, augmetic right arm, face like weathered stone. I explained the sensation, the pressure, the flexing. He listened without expression. When I finished, he told me to wait. He contacted the Departamento Munitorum via Vox. The transmission took 16 hours to route through proper channels. The response came back. Report symptoms to assigned medici. Continue duties unless manifestation of instability occurs. Reinforcement procedures would be scheduled when tactical situation permitted. When tactical situation permitted. We were in active war zone. Reinforcement procedures required specialized personnel and sanctified facilities. Neither were available on Viridian 3. I would have to wait for extraction to a rear echelon base. The commissar informed me this could take weeks, possibly months. I was to monitor the symptoms, report any escalation immediately, avoid excessive psychic channeling when possible, continue serving. I told Callum that evening. We were on watch duty 2 hours before dawn. He asked what the pressure felt like. I told him it felt like something pushing against a door. The door was still sealed, still strong, but something on the other side was testing it, probing for weakness. He asked if I was frightened. I told him I was uncertain. Fear required knowing what to fear. I did not know what was testing the binding. I did not know if it would find weakness. I only knew that eventually all seals degraded. That was the nature of entropy. He said entropy was a distant problem. Right now, the door was still closed. I should focus on keeping it that way. I agreed. The pressure increased over the following weeks. By the 10th month, it was constant, a dull ache behind my eyes that never fully faded. I reported the escalation. The commissar routed the information. The response was identical. Continue monitoring, avoid excessive channeling, extraction pending. The tactical situation had not improved. If anything, it had deteriorated. The Tau had brought reinforcements. Crute auxiliaries and Vespid support. The fighting intensified. My psychic support was critical to the command squad's survival. I could not cease operations without jeopardizing the mission. I reduced my channeling where possible, used conventional weapons when psychic abilities were not essential. But combat did not allow for restraint. When enemies attacked in force, I responded with necessary power. Each manifestation increased the strain. I could feel the binding flexing more severely now. The seal was holding, but something was eroding it from within. Slow degradation, molecular decay on a metaphysical level. At 11 months, I felt something new. Whispers, not audible, not exactly. Thoughts that were not mine occurring in spaces between my own thoughts. Fragments of sentences, promises, offers. I ignored them. The instructors had warned us about this. Warp entities attempting communication. They would try to bargain, seduce, threaten, confuse. The correct response was to reinforce mental barriers and report immediately. I reported. The commissar transmitted. The response: extraction being expedited, maintain discipline, Emperor protects, the Emperor protects. They told us this constantly. Whether it was true, I could not determine. The seal still held. Perhaps that was protection, or perhaps it was simply engineering, a well-constructed binding resisting natural degradation. Faith or physics, the outcome was identical. Callum noticed the change. He asked if I was well. I told him the binding was degrading faster than anticipated. He asked if I was in danger. I told him danger was relative. I was no more at risk than any soldier in a war zone, just a different kind of risk. He said if I needed anything, support, distraction, someone to talk to, he was available. I thanked him. The offer was unnecessary, but appreciated. He nodded and resumed his duties. The whispers increased. By month 12, they were occurring hourly. Different voices, different offers. Some promised power, some promised knowledge, some simply promised relief. I recognized the tactics. Warp entities did not offer genuine bargains. They offered hooks, small compromises that would create openings for larger intrusions. I rejected every offer. I reinforced my barriers. I recited the litanies I had been taught. But the whispers continued. The seal was eroding. The entities could sense it. They were circling like predators around wounded prey. I requested immediate extraction at month 13. The pressure had become pain, sharp and constant. The whispers were now occurring continuously. I could barely distinguish my own thoughts from the intrusions. I was losing cohesion. The commissar transmitted my request with urgency coding. The response took 4 days. Extraction approved. Transport to orbital station for reinforcement procedures. I was to report to landing zone designated Omega-7 in 6 hours. I informed Callum. He asked if I would return. I told him I did not know. Reinforcement procedures had variable success rates. If the binding could be strengthened, I would return. If not, I would be retired from active service, or executed if the deterioration had progressed too far. He asked which outcome I preferred. I told him I preferred to continue serving. Despite the pain, despite the risk, I preferred function to cessation. He understood. He said he would see me when I returned. Not if, when. The certainty was irrational but comforting. I gathered my equipment and proceeded to the landing zone. The transport was a Valkyrie, battered and worn. I boarded with 3 wounded guardsmen being evacuated for medical treatment. The pilot confirmed destination and launched. The flight to orbit took 40 minutes. I spent the time reinforcing my mental barriers. The whispers were insistent now, aggressive. They knew I was seeking reinforcement. They were trying to compromise me before the binding could be strengthened. The orbital station was a Navy facility, gray and utilitarian. I was processed through medical screening and directed to a sanctioned chamber similar to the one on Terra. A sanctioner met me there. He was old, possibly 90 standard years, more augmetic than organic. He examined my binding using instruments I did not recognize. After 17 minutes, he spoke. The degradation was severe. The seal had eroded approximately 40%. Entities had established preliminary connections. They had not achieved intrusion yet, but they were close. Reinforcement was possible, but would require extensive work. I would need to remain at the station for a minimum of 2 weeks while the procedures were performed. I agreed. I had no alternative. The sanctioner began immediately. The process involved layering additional wards over the existing binding. Prayers and rituals performed while I maintained mental discipline. It was excruciating. Each new ward burned as it settled into place. The entities fought the reinforcement, thrashing against my consciousness, trying to disrupt my concentration. I held. Hours passed. The sanctioner worked methodically, speaking in cant mechanicus, inscribing psychic symbols in the air with his augmetic hands. After 6 hours, he stopped. The initial reinforcement was complete. The binding was stabilized at current degradation level. Further erosion had been halted, but the existing damage could not be fully repaired. The seal would never return to original strength. I was compromised, functional but permanently weakened. I would require monitoring, regular checkups, reduced operational tempo. The sanctioner said I could return to duty, but I was now high risk. Any indication of further degradation would result in immediate termination. I acknowledged understanding. I remained at the station for the full 2 weeks. The sanctioner performed additional reinforcement sessions. By the end, the pain had diminished to manageable levels. The whispers had reduced to occasional intrusions. I was stable. The binding held. I was cleared to return to my regiment. The transport back to Viridian 3 departed on day 16. I was the only passenger. The pilot told me the tactical situation had changed. The Tau had withdrawn 3 days prior. Naval bombardment had destroyed their supply lines. The regiment was transitioning to occupation and security operations. Active combat had ceased. I felt something that might have been relief or disappointment. The adrenaline of combat had distracted me from the binding's degradation. Peacekeeping operations would provide no such distraction. I would have time to notice every fluctuation, every new intrusion attempt, every sign that the reinforcement was failing. We landed at the main firebase. I disembarked and reported to command. The commissar logged my return and assigned me to routine patrol duties. Light operations, minimal psychic channeling. I was being preserved, treated as a resource that needed conservation. I understood the logic but resented the necessity. Callum found me 2 hours after my return. He was in the mess area, eating ration packs. He saw me enter and waved. I approached. He asked how the reinforcement went. I told him I was functional but compromised. The binding would never be as strong as it had been. I was on borrowed time now. He said borrowed time was better than no time. He was correct. We resumed operations together. The patrols were uneventful. Viridian 3 was secured. The population was cooperative, grateful for liberation from Tau occupation. We walked designated routes, checked security points, filed reports. It was mundane, but mundane was safe. Safe allowed the binding to rest. I welcomed it. 3 months into occupation duty, I felt the pressure return. Faint at first, just like before. I immediately reported to the commissar. He transmitted the information. The response came within 8 hours this time. I was to return to the orbital station for evaluation. No delays. The Navy was taking binding degradation seriously now. I'd become a documented risk. Monitoring was mandatory. I returned to the station. The same sanctioner examined me. The reinforced binding had held structurally, but new erosion had begun at different points. The seal was degrading in multiple locations now. This was expected, he said. My binding had sustained damage. Damaged bindings were more susceptible to future deterioration. I was entering a maintenance cycle. Regular reinforcement would be required every few months to prevent catastrophic failure. I asked if this was sustainable long-term. He said it was not. Eventually, the binding would erode past the point where reinforcement was effective. That could take years or decades, but it was inevitable. I asked what would happen when that point was reached. He said I would be retired from service, confined to a monitoring facility, kept under observation until the binding failed completely. Then I would be executed. Controlled termination before entities could achieve manifestation. It was the only humane option. I asked how long I had. He said there was no way to calculate precisely. It depended on numerous variables, psychic activity levels, exposure to warp phenomena, individual resistance. I could have 10 years, I could have 10 months. He recommended I reduce combat operations to the absolute minimum. I returned to the regiment with this information. The commissar reassigned me to non-combat duties. I would serve as advisor and trainer. No more field operations, no more channeling unless absolutely critical. I was being shelved, preserved but inactive. Callum said it was probably for the best. I would live longer this way. I told him living longer was not the same as living meaningfully. He said meaning was whatever you made of it. Even training duties served purpose. I was passing knowledge to others. That had value. I wanted to believe him. I trained new psychers for the next 2 years. Young recruits fresh from sanctioning, terrified and uncertain. I taught them what the instructors had taught me: control, discipline, recognition of warning signs. I showed them the litanies and techniques. I told them about binding degradation. I emphasized the importance of early reporting. I became what my instructors had been: functional, experienced, already eroding. The pressure continued increasing. The reinforcements came every 4 months now, then every 3 months, then every 2. The sanctioner's expression grew more concerned with each examination. The degradation was accelerating. The binding was failing faster than anticipated. He could not explain why. Sometimes psychers simply degraded more rapidly. Genetic factors, perhaps, or exposure to particularly aggressive entities. The cause was less important than the outcome. I was approaching critical threshold. At year 4 of my service, during routine reinforcement, the sanctioner told me I had perhaps 6 months remaining, maybe less. The binding was sustaining multiple erosion sites. Reinforcement was becoming less effective. The entities were adapting to the wards, learning to circumvent them. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Some warp entities were more persistent than others, more intelligent. They would probe defenses for years, learning patterns, waiting for opportunity. I had apparently attracted such entities' attention. I asked if there was anything I could do. He said no. I could minimize psychic activity, but I was already doing that. I could pray, but prayer was psychological comfort rather than practical defense. I could simply wait. Continue reinforcement sessions. Hope the binding held longer than estimated. But I should prepare for termination. Begin making peace with whatever I needed to make peace with. I told Callum that evening. We were in the fire-based chapel, alone. The regiment's priest had finished evening prayers hours earlier. The space was empty and cold. I told him the binding was failing, that I had months remaining, that I would be terminated when the seal collapsed. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked if I was frightened. I told him I was uncertain. I had been living with this knowledge for years. It had become abstract, background data. But now that the timeline was concrete, the abstraction was becoming real. Yes, I was frightened. Not of death, of losing control before death, of becoming a vector for something that would harm others. That frightened me. He asked what he could do. I told him there was nothing to do. He could simply be present. That was enough. He said he would be present until the end, however long that took. I thanked him. The gratitude felt inadequate, but it was all I had. The degradation accelerated faster than the sanctioner had predicted. By the 5th month, I was experiencing intrusions daily, not just whispers now, full sensory hallucinations. I would see things that were not present, shadows moving in peripheral vision, figures standing in empty spaces. I would hear voices speaking my name, offering bargains, describing what they would do when they finally breached the seal. I knew these were manifestations of warp entities testing my perception, trying to establish footholds in my consciousness. I rejected each intrusion, reinforced my barriers, recited the litanies, but they kept coming. The commissar ordered me confined to quarters when I was not in reinforcement sessions. Too dangerous to move freely. I might manifest unintentionally, might channel something without conscious intent. The confinement was for everyone's safety, including mine. I accepted the restriction. Callum visited daily. He would bring ration packs and sit with me while I ate. He talked about regiment operations, about the other soldiers, about nothing important. The conversation was distraction. I appreciated it. During the 6th month, I felt something shift. The binding did not flex this time. It cracked, not catastrophic failure. A hairline fracture in the seal, but through that fracture, something pressed. I felt its presence more clearly now. It had been circling for years, probing my defenses, learning my patterns. Now it had found a weakness, a way in. The presence pushed against the fracture, trying to widen it. I pushed back. The contest lasted 3 hours. I barely held. When it finally withdrew, I was shaking. Sweat covered my body. I had defeated it, temporarily. But the presence would return. It knew the fracture existed now. It would focus all its efforts there. I reported immediately. The commissar transmitted emergency priority. The response came within 2 hours. I was to return to the orbital station for immediate evaluation and potential termination. The binding had entered terminal failure. Further reinforcement was unlikely to be effective. I was now an imminent threat. Protocol required inquisitorial approval for Sanctioned Psyker execution, but preparations should begin. A transport would arrive within 6 hours. I gathered nothing. I owned nothing worth gathering. Callum met me at the landing zone. He said something, but I do not recall what. My focus was internal. The presence was pushing again. Constant pressure against the fracture. I was allocating most of my concentration to holding it back. Speaking required effort I could barely spare. I managed to tell him I would not return this time. He knew. He said nothing else. He gripped my shoulder once, briefly. Then I boarded the transport. The flight to the station took 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, the presence pushed 17 times. Each push lasted longer, grew stronger. It was learning the fracture structure, finding leverage points. I held, but barely. By the time we docked, I was exhausted. Mental fatigue deeper than anything I'd experienced. The kind of tired that makes you wonder if surrender would be easier than continuing. The sanctioner was waiting. He examined the binding for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he stated the obvious. Terminal failure. The fracture had compromised structural integrity. The seal would collapse within days, possibly hours. Reinforcement was no longer viable. I required immediate termination. He would begin the authorization process. Inquisitorial approval was mandatory for Sanctioned Psyker executions. Protocol could not be circumvented. The request would be transmitted immediately. Response time varied, but typically required between 3 and 7 days. I would be contained in a secure facility until approval arrived. I asked what would happen if the binding failed before approval was received. He said containment protocols would activate. The facility was warded, psychically shielded, designed to contain even fully manifested demons temporarily. If I lost control, I would be sealed inside until inquisitorial assets arrived to handle the situation. He said this matter-of-factly. No emotion, just procedure. I was a problem awaiting solution. The solution would be implemented according to established protocol. They moved me to a containment cell. 3 meters by 3 meters, reinforced walls inscribed with hexagrammic wards. Psychic dampening field active at all times. The field pressed against my mind with familiar weight, like the black ship's hold years ago. The pressure provided structure, made it harder for the presence to push. I felt slight relief. Slight. The presence was still there, still pushing. But the dampening field helped. I sat on the floor. There was a cot, but I could not sleep. Sleep required letting my guard down. If I lowered my barriers, the presence would surge through the fracture. I needed to remain conscious, remain vigilant, hold the line until approval arrived, and they could end this properly. The first day was manageable. The presence pushed constantly, but I held. The dampening field helped. My training helped. Decades of discipline and control. I recited the litanies, focused on the Emperor's image as I had been taught. Whether the Emperor was actually aware of my struggle was irrelevant. The mental focus provided structure. Structure provided strength. The second day was harder. Fatigue was accumulating. I had not slept in 37 hours. The presence was adapting to my defensive patterns. Finding new angles of attack, I would block one approach, and it would immediately try another. It was intelligent, not mindlessly aggressive, calculating, patient. It knew I was weakening. It could afford to wait. Callum appeared on the third day. I do not know how he gained access to the station. He should not have been permitted aboard. But he was there, standing outside my containment cell, speaking to me through the observation port. He asked how I was holding. I told him I was holding. Barely. The binding would fail soon. I could feel it continuing to fracture. The presence was widening the break incrementally. I had days remaining, perhaps hours. He asked if the Inquisition had responded. I told him not yet. He said they would respond in time. I needed to hold. I told him I was trying. He visited every 6 hours after that. Brief visits. He would talk to me, help me maintain focus, remind me of why I was holding. If I failed, if the presence achieved manifestation, it would kill everyone on the station. Thousands of personnel. Then it would attempt to reach the planet below. More thousands, more millions. I was the only barrier preventing that outcome. I needed to hold. I told him I understood. I would hold as long as I could. On the fourth day, the fracture widened significantly. I felt the seal tear. Not complete failure, not yet, but a tear, a gap. The presence surged through immediately. I felt it enter my consciousness, not full intrusion, partial. It occupied perhaps 10% of my awareness. I could feel its thoughts overlapping mine, its desires bleeding into my perceptions. It wanted out, wanted flesh, wanted to manifest in real space and feed. I pushed against it, tried to force it back through the gap. It resisted. We struggled. The contest lasted hours. I won. Barely. I managed to compress the presence back through the gap. But I could not seal the tear. The binding was too damaged. The gap remained. The presence would return, stronger next time, more prepared. I was losing. I reported the intrusion to the Sanctioner via Vox. He acknowledged. The inquisitorial authorization still had not arrived. I needed to continue holding. I told him I would try. Callum visited during hour 73. I could barely focus on his words. Most of my concentration was internal, fighting the presence. It was pushing constantly now, trying to widen the gap, trying to force more of itself through. I was holding it at 10% intrusion. If it reached 20%, I would lose the ability to suppress it. If it reached 50%, it would achieve enough control to manifest physically. I could not allow that. He asked what he could do. I told him there was nothing. This was internal. My fight. He could not help. He said he would stay anyway. He would remain outside the containment cell. Present. I would not face this alone. The statement was irrational. I was fundamentally alone. No one else could enter my consciousness. No one else could fight this battle. But his presence outside the cell provided something: anchor, connection, reminder that there were people beyond my mind worth protecting. I thanked him. On the 5th day, I felt the presence achieve 20% intrusion. It had widened the gap despite my resistance. I was failing. I could feel my control slipping. The presence was spreading through my consciousness like infection through tissue. Slow but inexorable. I tried to contain it, tried to wall it off, but it kept expanding, finding new pathways, colonizing my thoughts. I began experiencing its memories, fragments of other psykers it had corrupted, other minds it had invaded and consumed. I saw them dying, saw their final moments as the presence overwhelmed them and used their bodies to manifest. I saw what it did after manifestation. The feeding, the killing, the pleasure it derived from destruction. These were not visions meant to terrify me. These were simply its memories. This was what it was. This was what it would do if I failed. I could not fail. I reinforced my remaining defenses, compressed my consciousness into the portions it had not yet invaded, made myself smaller, denser, harder to infiltrate. The strategy worked temporarily. The presence's expansion slowed, but it did not stop. It could not be stopped, only delayed. Callum spoke to me during hour 97. His voice was distant. I could barely process his words. He was saying something about authorization, about the Inquisition. I forced myself to focus. He repeated the information. The authorization had arrived. The Inquisitor had approved my execution. The Sanctioner was preparing the procedure. It would be conducted within 6 hours. I only needed to hold for 6 more hours. Then it would end. I acknowledged. 6 hours. I could hold 6 hours. Probably. The presence heard this. It understood. It increased the pressure immediately. Aggressive pushing, trying to achieve full intrusion before the execution could be performed. It had waited years for this opportunity. It would not allow itself to be cheated by dying with me. It needed to manifest, needed to cross fully into real space. It pushed with everything it had. I pushed back. The struggle was titanic, internal warfare occurring in spaces between thoughts. We fought for control of my motor functions, for access to my psychic abilities, for dominance over my body. The presence wanted to manifest. I wanted to deny it that satisfaction. We were locked, neither advancing, neither retreating, pure contest of will. Hour 98. The presence achieved 30% intrusion. I felt my left hand move without my instruction. The presence had gained partial motor control. I forced the hand still. The presence tried again. My hand twitched, fingers flexing involuntarily. I focused all available willpower on suppressing the movement. The hand stilled, but the presence had demonstrated capability. It could move me now. If it gained more intrusion, it could make me act, make me channel, make me kill. I looked at the containment cell's wards. If I channeled psychic energy, even unintentionally, the wards would react. They would attempt to contain the manifestation. But wards could fail. Had failed before. I could not risk it. I needed to suppress any channeling until the execution. I focused on closing every pathway to my abilities, locked them down, made them inaccessible. The presence raged against this. It needed those abilities to manifest fully. I denied it access. Hour 99, 40% intrusion. The presence was speaking through my mouth now, not constantly, intermittently. I would hear my voice saying things I had not intended to say, promises, threats, bargains. The presence was trying to communicate with the personnel outside, trying to negotiate, to lie, to manipulate. I forced my mouth closed, bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood. The pain helped, gave me something to focus on besides the presence. My mouth stayed closed. Callum was still outside the cell. I could see him through the observation port. His expression was controlled, professional. But I could see the tension, the fear. He was watching me fight something he could not see, could not help with, could only witness. He met my eyes, nodded once. The gesture said everything. Hold, just hold. Hour 100. 50% intrusion. The presence achieved equilibrium. We each controlled half my consciousness. It could move portions of my body, could access portions of my abilities, could think thoughts that originated in spaces I could no longer access. But I still controlled enough to prevent full manifestation. We were deadlocked. The question was whether I could maintain the deadlock for 2 more hours. The presence began negotiating, not with external personnel, with me. It spoke directly into my thoughts, offered bargains. If I allowed it to manifest, it would kill quickly, minimize suffering. If I continued resisting, it would make my final hours excruciating. It would push against every barrier, make me feel every moment of the struggle. The execution was coming regardless. Why suffer pointlessly? Why not surrender and end the pain? I rejected the offer. The presence did not understand. Or it understood but did not care. I was not fighting to save myself. I was fighting to prevent manifestation. If it killed me, that was acceptable. If it killed me after I had prevented it from manifesting, that was victory. My suffering was irrelevant. My death was inevitable. But I could control the circumstances. I could deny it what it wanted most. That was enough. Hour 101. The presence pushed harder. I felt something inside me begin to crack. Not the binding. That was already shattered. Something else. Something fundamental, my sense of self, my identity. The presence was not just invading my consciousness, it was trying to erase me, to overwrite my personality with its own. If it could eliminate my resistance by eliminating me, it would achieve full control, full manifestation. I focused on memory, on anchoring myself in who I had been. I thought about my father's face, about the cold detention block, about the black ship, about sanctioning, about Callum, about every experience that had made me who I was. I held those memories like shields. The presence tried to corrupt them, tried to insert itself into the memories, tried to make me believe it had always been there. I rejected the intrusions. These memories were mine. They defined me. Without them, I was nothing. I would not surrender them. Hour 102. The sanctioner appeared outside the cell. He was accompanied by 2 armed guards and a priest, the execution team. They were preparing the chamber. I would be moved to an execution facility in the station's secure sub-level. The procedure would be conducted there. Bolt round to the school. Immediate cremation. Standard protocol for compromised psychers. The sanctioner asked if I could walk. I told him I would try. They opened the containment cell. The dampening field deactivated. Without the field's pressure, the presence surged. It attempted to seize full control immediately. I fought, held it at 50%. Barely. I stood. My legs were shaking. I'd been sitting for 5 days without proper rest. My body was weak, but I could walk. I took one step, then another. The guards flanked me, ready to kill me if I lost control. I understood. I appreciated their readiness. If I failed, they needed to respond instantly. We walked through the station corridors. Personnel cleared our path. They knew what I was, what I contained. They maintained distance, watched with expressions mixing fear and pity. I ignored them, focused on walking, on maintaining control, on not allowing the presence to manifest during transit. We passed through 3 security checkpoints. Each time the guards verified credentials, confirmed authorization. The bureaucracy continued even at the edge of catastrophe. Callum was waiting at the execution facility entrance. He had somehow gained clearance to witness. Or he had ignored clearance requirements. Either way, he was there. He fell into step beside me. The guards did not stop him. Perhaps they understood. Perhaps they simply did not care. We were entering the execution facility regardless. One additional witness was irrelevant. The execution chamber was small. Reinforced walls. Psychic wards inscribed everywhere. A single chair in the center. Restraints attached. An incinerator built into the far wall. Efficient. The entire procedure would occur in one location. No transport of remains necessary. I would die in this chair. My body would be reduced to ash in that incinerator. The ash would be jettisoned into space. Nothing of me would remain. They directed me to the chair. I sat. The restraints closed around my wrists and ankles. Unnecessary, probably. I was not going to resist, but protocol demanded restraints. I accepted them. The priest began reciting prayers, last rites, blessing my soul's return to the Emperor. I did not know if the Emperor would receive my soul. I did not know if the Emperor was even aware of my existence, but the prayers provided structure to the moment. Ritual made death processible. Callum stood to my left. He was not speaking, just present, watching. His face was blank, not emotionless, controlled. He was processing something internally. I wished I could tell him this was not failure, that holding until execution was victory, that I had won by not losing, but speaking required concentration I needed elsewhere. The presence was pushing maximally now. It knew death was imminent. It was making final attempts to achieve manifestation before I died, and took it with me. 60% intrusion. I felt my barriers crumbling. The presence was overwhelming me through sheer persistent pressure. I compressed myself into the remaining 40%. Made my consciousness as dense and defended as possible. The presence expanded into the space I had abandoned. It was winning, but it was running out of time. The sanctioner approached with a bolt pistol. Standard Astra Militarum issue, loaded with a single round. He positioned himself directly in front of me, aimed at my forehead, asked if I had final words. I managed to speak, barely. My voice was hoarse, damaged from days without proper hydration. I said 4 words. The Emperor is satisfied. Not true, probably, but appropriate. The priest nodded approval. The sanctioner prepared to fire. 70% intrusion. The presence was screaming, not audibly, psychically, raging against the approaching termination. It had invested years in corrupting me, years of effort about to be wasted. It tried one final push, attempted to seize control of my body, force me to move, to dodge, to channel, anything to disrupt the execution. I held, used every fragment of remaining willpower, locked my body motionless. The presence could not move me. Not enough, not in time. I looked at Callum. He was watching me, not the sanctioner, me. I tried to convey something with my expression, gratitude, perhaps, recognition, acknowledgement that his presence had mattered, that his visits had helped me hold, that I was not dying alone because he had chosen to be here. I do not know if the message transmitted. His face remained controlled, but he nodded. Once. Small movement. I understood it as acceptance, as goodbye. The sanctioner fired. I felt the impact, skull fragmenting, bullet entering brain tissue, consciousness disrupting. The presence screamed. It was being destroyed along with me, dragged back into the warp as my consciousness collapsed. It had failed. I had won. We died together, but I died having denied it what it wanted. That was victory. That was enough. The pain lasted perhaps 2 seconds, then darkness, then nothing. I have no memory of what occurred after. The medical logs indicate my body remained animate for 4.3 seconds post-impact. Autonomic systems continuing briefly after brain death. Then full cessation. They removed the restraints, transferred my remains to the incinerator. Cremation took 11 minutes. The ash was collected and jettisoned into space. Total procedure duration, 47 minutes from entry to completion. Efficient, professional. One more compromised psyker processed according to protocol. Callum filed a commendation request, recommended me for posthumous recognition, cited my resistance against warp intrusion, noted that I had maintained control for 6 days, past predicted binding failure, prevented demon manifestation despite terminal degradation, protected thousands of personnel through willpower alone. The commendation was reviewed and denied. Sanctioned Psykers who required execution were not eligible for honors. Maintaining control until authorized termination was expected duty, not exceptional service. The denial was logged. Callum's request was archived. My service record was marked as terminated with notation. Binding failure, authorization executed, remains disposed. No one knows what I held back. No one knows how close the presence came to manifesting. No one knows that thousands of personnel were hours away from demonic intrusion. The official record shows a psyker who degraded and was terminated according to protocol. Standard procedure. Occurs thousands of times across the Imperium annually. Unremarkable, but I know. In whatever space consciousness occupies after death, I know. I held. For 6 days, I fought something that wanted to wear my body like a suit and kill everyone within reach. I fought it to a standstill. I denied it manifestation. I won. Not because I survived, and did not survive, but because I maintained control until the bolt round ended it. The system almost failed, almost allowed a demon into real space. My willpower was the only barrier, and the barrier held. Callum knows. He witnessed the final moments. He saw me fighting something he could not see. He understood what was at stake. He filed the commendation because he knew I had earned it. The denial does not change what happened, does not erase the victory. The Imperium did not recognize it, but he did. That is enough. The binding held for 11 years after sanctioning. That is below average for beta-grade psykers. Most achieve 15 to 20 years before terminal degradation. I degraded faster. Perhaps genetic factors. Perhaps exposure. Perhaps simply bad fortune. The warp does not distribute its attention fairly. Some psykers attract more aggressive entities. I was one of them. The presence that corrupted me was patient and intelligent. It invested years in breaking my binder. It almost succeeded. Almost. That word carries weight. The presence almost manifested. Almost achieved its goal. Almost killed thousands. But almost is not success. Almost is failure. I ensured its failure. That was my final contribution. My last act of service, holding until the bolt round arrived. The Imperium requires psykers. Billions of humans across 1 million worlds manifest psychic potential annually. Most are never detected. They live and die without anyone knowing what they are. Some are detected and culled immediately. Local authorities eliminating threats before they grow. Some are detected and transported to the black ships, evaluated, sanctioned, or destroyed. Those who survive sanctioning serve. For years or decades, they channel the warp in service to the Imperium. Then their bindings fail. Then they are terminated. The cycle continues, has continued for 10,000 years, will continue until the Imperium falls, or humanity evolves past psychic manifestation. I was one psyker in that cycle, one among billions. My service was unremarkable. My death was unremarkable. The only remarkable element was how close I came to catastrophic failure. How close the binding came to allowing demonic manifestation. That proximity to disaster was never recorded, never acknowledged. The system does not document near misses, only successes and failures. I died before failing, therefore success. The fact that success required 6 days of continuous mental warfare is irrelevant to the record. But it is not irrelevant to me, or to Callum, or to the 1,000 personnel who continued their duties unaware they were meters away from a manifesting demon. They did not know. They continued working, eating, sleeping, living. Because I held, because I fought, because I refused to surrender even when surrender would have ended the pain. That is what Sanctioned Psykers do. We hold. We fight internal battles against entities that want to use us as doorways. We hold until the binding fails. Then we die. Most of us die quietly, executed before manifestation. Some fail to hold, lose control, manifest something that kills everyone nearby before being destroyed. Those failures are remembered, taught as cautionary tales, used to frighten new psykers into compliance. The quiet successes are forgotten, the psykers who held until execution, who died having prevented manifestation. We are not remembered. We are processed and discarded, our ashes scattered, our names forgotten. I do not resent this. Recognition was never the goal. Service was the goal. I served. I fulfilled my function. I held when holding was all I could do. That is enough. The binding's failure was inevitable. All bindings fail eventually. Entropy erodes everything. Psychic seals, physical structures, memories, lives. The Imperium is built on technologies and rituals designed to slow entropy, but entropy cannot be defeated, only delayed. My binding delayed warp intrusion for 11 years. Then it failed. I delayed manifestation for 6 additional days. Then I died. The delays were all I could provide. They were enough. Callum returned to the regiment. I do not know what happened to him after, whether he survived the war, whether he transferred to another unit, whether he died in some engagement I was not present for. The records do not say. He is one more soldier among billions, unremarkable except to me. He mattered. His presence during those final days mattered. The visits, the conversation, the witness. He gave me reason to hold, reminded me that beyond my internal struggle, there were people worth protecting. That made the fight bearable. I think about my father sometimes, about his blank expression when the transport took me. He knew I was being conscripted into something that would consume me. He could not stop it, could not save me, could only watch the Imperium take his son and process him into a weapon. I wonder if he grieved, if he prayed for me, if he told himself the sacrifice was necessary. I do not know. I never saw him again after that day. Never received communication, never learned if he survived or how he died. He is lost to me. One more connection severed by the Imperium's requirements. I remember the cold, -18 degrees Celsius in the detention block. That memory persists. Everything else has faded or been corrupted by the presence's intrusion. But the cold remains, specific and real, the last pure memory of the person I was before sanctioning, before the binding, before the degradation. I was 14 years old, frightened, uncertain, alone. The Imperium took that boy and converted him into a weapon, used him for 11 years, then destroyed him when he became liability. Standard procedure. Necessary procedure. The Imperium survives through such conversions, through such destruction. I do not condemn this. I do not praise it. I simply recognize it. The Imperium consumes. It converts individuals into components, uses them until they fail, discards them. The process is efficient, brutal, necessary. Humanity survives because the Imperium processes billions into service. Some serve as soldiers, some as workers, some as psychers. We are all fuel. We are all being consumed. The only question is how much we accomplish before consumption completes. I accomplished enough. I served for 11 years. I prevented demon manifestation during terminal binding failure. I died having maintained control. That is more than many psychers achieve. It is enough. The presence is gone now, destroyed when I died. Dragged back into the warp, its investment wasted. It spent years corrupting me, years of effort and patience, all for nothing. It failed. I won. The victory was Pyrrhic. I died. But Pyrrhic victory is still victory. The demon did not manifest. The personnel survived. The Imperium continued functioning. My death enabled that continuation. That is what service means. Sacrifice that enables continuation. We do not sacrifice for glory or recognition. We sacrifice because the alternative is collapse. The Imperium teeters on the edge of annihilation constantly. Enemies without, corruption within, entropy everywhere. It survives through constant sacrifice, constant vigilance, constant willingness to destroy components before they compromise the whole. I was a component. I was destroyed. The whole survived. That is success. I am testament to a truth the Imperium does not acknowledge. The system almost fails constantly. Every day, across 1 million worlds, compromised components nearly bring disaster. Psychers whose bindings are failing. Tech priests whose maintenance is inadequate. Soldiers whose loyalty wavers. The system catches most problems, terminates most threats, but not all. Some slip through. Some manifest. Some cause the disasters that make the historical record. I was almost one of those disasters. Almost. The margin was 6 days of mental warfare. 6 days between functional containment and demonic manifestation. The system almost failed, but it did not fail, because I held. How many others hold? How many psychers fight similar battles in silence? How many soldiers resist corruption alone? How many components of the Imperium's machinery strain against failure every moment? The records do not say. The system does not track near misses. Only catastrophic failures and successful operations. Everything between is invisible, unrecorded, forgotten. I'm one of those invisible victories. I held. I died. The system continued. No one remembers. No one except Callum, and he will die eventually. His memory will die with him. Then I will be truly erased. Just another name in personnel archives. Sanctioned Psyker. Binding failed. Executed. Remains disposed. Standard notation. Unremarkable. But I know. In death, I know. I won. The presence lost. The personnel survived. The Imperium continued. That is all any of us can hope for. To hold until we cannot. To die having prevented failure. To be forgotten having served. The binding held for 11 years. It failed over 6 days. I held for 6 more days. Then I died. That is the testimony. That is the record. Not the official record. That record is brief and dismissive. But the true record, the internal record, the one that matters to me. And I was sanctioned at age 14. I served until age 25. 11 years of channeling the warp, of manifesting powers I did not fully understand, of living with a seal in my mind that burned constantly, of knowing the seal would eventually fail, of waiting for that failure. It came, I faced it, I held, I died. That is the arc, that is the life. The Imperium required my service. I provided it. The Imperium required my death. I provided that too. I have no complaints, no regrets. I did what I could with what I had. The outcome was not ideal. I died young, in pain, fighting something invisible. But the outcome was acceptable. I prevented disaster, maintained control until authorized termination. That was the duty. I fulfilled it. Callum will remember for a time. Then he too will forget. Or he will die. Either way, the memory will fade. I will become one more anonymous casualty among trillions. One more psyker executed for binding failure. One more ash scatter in the void. The Imperium will continue. New psykers will be sanctioned. New bindings will be formed. New failures will occur. The cycle perpetuates. I'm simply one iteration, unremarkable except in my own experience. But in my own experience, I was remarkable. I fought something that wanted to wear my body and kill with my abilities. I fought it for 6 days without rest, without relief, without hope of survival. I fought because fighting was necessary, because surrendering would have meant disaster. I won. Not because I survived, but because the demon did not manifest. Because I died first. That is victory, Pyrrhic, invisible, forgotten. But victory nonetheless. I was a sanctioned psyker. My binding failed. I held until execution. That is the testimony. That is all there is. The cold was -18 degrees Celsius. I remember that. I hold that memory even in death. The boy in the detention block, 14 years old, hands sparking with power he could not control. The boy who would become a weapon, who would serve, who would hold, who would die having prevented catastrophe. That boy is me. I was him. I remember. The boat round destroyed my skull. My consciousness collapsed. The presence was dragged back into the warp, screaming. I died. But I died victorious. The margin was narrow. The struggle was invisible. The victory was unrecognized. But it was victory. That is enough. That is all. That is everything. I held. I died. The Imperium continued. That is the testimony. That is the truth. That is what it means to be a sanctioned psyker when your soul binding fails. You hold, you fight, you die, and if you are fortunate, you die having prevented the manifestation, having maintained control until the bolt round arrives. That is all any of us can hope for. I achieved it. I won. The binding held for 11 years. I held for 6 days more. Then nothing. Then this. Testimony from beyond. Record of what was not recorded. Memory of what will be forgotten. I was here. I fought. I held. I won. That is all. That is enough.